There's a standard we put on everybody. And I think the founding fathers intended a standard on politicians. I think they assumed, and they assumed rightly for 250 years, that politicians, what would sift out the bad ones, the ones without character, is the election system, right? I mean, if somebody has no character and it's found out, typically they lose an election. Typically they're shamed, whatever. That was the system. So while if you're an elected official, you don't really have a boss, the boss is the people, and the people are the ones that can execute that punishment. What's happened, Steve, and I know you know this well, and by the way, I've got to say to you, just because I'm thinking of it and I don't forget, you're the purveyor of country first, the idea of it and the message. I know with McCain, and my organization is called Country First. So you own that, and I want to thank you for bringing the word and message forward from the inception. So I want to give you credit for that. It's important. But on the character side with leader, so what Donald Trump has done well, okay, what he's done well is he's convinced people that he is a big Billy badass, right? That he's standing in this gap for you. When he says crazy things on Twitter, it's not because he's crazy, it's because he's outraged for you. And that's what people think. That's what people have been convinced. They've been convinced that he is tough. The truth of the matter is, he's the whiniest, littlest, self-absorbedest, whatever that word is. He's the most biggest, like, sissy whiner. It's exhausting and it's annoying. But he has convinced people through his anger and his whatever that he's this tough guy. So they will take his character flaws and say, he's got that flawed character, yes, but what we love about him is he's not going to let the left bully him into shame. I mean, what is it we always say? His great superpower is shamelessness. And so that's what's happened. That's what I've been saying lately, particularly, and I put this on Substack, I think today, which is, look, Joe Biden, one of the things I think he can do to take out Donald Trump is, instead of saying, I'm scared to death of him, or I'm worried about democracy, which I think we have to say. I'm not saying don't say that, because that matters to a certain segment of people. I think we have to start belittling him for the narcissistic, again, just weak man he really is, because that is his superpower in the base. And I think we have to begin to expose that. So I think the lack of character thing just came from, people like him, people like Santos, just having no shame and saying that they have no shame, in essence, on behalf of people. I mean, what do you think on it? Because that's what I've been, like, kind of playing around with, is this idea that when you play him up to be this threat, that's actually working in his favor in a certain segment.
Well, fear is a contagion, and it's something that I write about. You can go back and really, I think, look at Pope John Paul II as a guide and a model on his inaugural visit to Poland, which is a visit that geopolitically sets in motion events that within a decade contribute mightily to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so what does John Paul say to confront communism in Polish to his native Poles who've been subjugated at that point since 1939? What he says to them is, be not afraid. Yep. In the tradition of fearlessness, Franklin Roosevelt talked about this. Freedom from fear, freedom from want, the contagion of fear, its capacity to spread panic. So when the country hears its vice president go on The View and deliver a message that says, I'm scared as heck, it's worrying, because the moment calls for defiance against a real threat. And so there are two things, in my view, that you just hit bingo on. And the first one is how you fight Trump, which is through mockery and sarcasm and belittlement and everything that you can think of that diminishes him. But I want to put that aside for a minute, and we'll come back to the politics. But when you look at the country, and I think you rightly diagnosed, right, this character change. I mean, he is more than any male that exists in the culture. He's the antithesis of the iconic male of the black and white movies we grew up with. John Wayne, Charles Bronson, Clint Eastwood, right? Silent, tough, Jimmy Stewart, right? I mean, he is an appalling figure, needy, whiny, complaining, soft, evasive, dishonest, right? Every conceivable character flaw. But what does it say about the country that they're susceptible to it? Two, what does it say about the Democratic Party that if the election were tomorrow, even money is, Joe Biden loses the election to him?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I look, so we have to be honest about how we got to this place, which is, and I can say, because there's moments when and I think every man out there has felt this at some point, which is, you know, when we talk about the value of feminine traits, the value of women, and we have in the last number of years pushed aside men and said masculinity is toxic. And I'm not saying like masculine, I mean, I'm not, it's a whole messy debate. But what happens is if you're a white male living in the Midwest and you get hit with these constant messages of toxic masculinity, I mean, what was it? One of the shaving companies, Gillette, put out like some 1 minute ad about, oh, is this the best we are? That kind of stuff. Some of that makes sense because there's such thing as toxic masculinity. Let's be clear. You see this particularly in the MAGA movement, but there's also healthy masculinity. And I think what's happened is over time, that's been kind of pushed aside. Men particularly have been pushed aside in men's minds, true or not, I don't know, but they've been pushed aside. And then somebody came along and spoke to that fear and reflected that fear back to them. So this is the thing about fear. Like, politicians harness fear, and sometimes it's in good ways, fear of communism, fear of unemployment, fear of, racial and social inequity. Those are true fears. And I think a politician has to harness that. And politicians in the past, by and large, also knew that that power that they were harnessing came with great, as Spider-Man said, great power comes great responsibility. And so I guess it was his uncle that said that. But anyway, they understood that they had a responsibility to use fear, but then bring back optimism. When Donald Trump came along and his toxic MAGA base, and they simply reflect the fear that you already have in your heart back to you, or the anger you have, and say you should be angry, like that's how you pull people in. That's how cults work. That's how dictatorships get built. They create that fear. If you think about fear, everybody has fear. There's nobody on here that doesn't have fear. We all have fear, okay? And what we do is we try to confront that. We also have darkness in our heart, every one of us. And every day we have a battle in our heart between the light and the dark. And when a leader comes along, like Trump, okay, President of the United States, for God's sakes, for 4 years, when he comes along and he speaks back to you the darkness in your heart, and he says, your fear of immigrants, it's real. Your fear of minorities, it's real. Your fear of being excluded, it's real. When somebody with power speaks the dark parts of your heart, it gives you permission to let that overtake you. And as we all know, letting the darkness overtake you is much easier than fighting it. It kills you, but it's much easier in the moment. So am I getting deep in the weeds? Yes. Does it make sense to some of you? Maybe not. And I'm sorry about that, but that's the best way I can describe is there's been this like harvesting of people's fears going on and people's darkness going on. And there's been nothing to then root that fear into positive action. We always said, this was said early on by Arthur Brooks, who I know you know well, and I do too. Great guy. He would always say, until it was disproven by Trump, he's like, leaders do well by fighting, but fighting up and punching on behalf of people. Donald Trump came along and he punches down and he punches against people. He doesn't fight for Americans, he fights Americans. And some people like that, unfortunately, and that's grown. And the other big problem, Steve, is that nobody in the Republican Party, with rare exception, stands up to him. So when he gets indicted and everybody says, oh yeah, he's a victim, of course, then everybody that trusts these people are going to say he's a victim. When Nikki Haley's saying he's a victim, right? And because somebody like me, Liz Cheney, or you goes out on a limb and says the truth, you can get ostracized because that's what cults do, and it's a cult.